In the previous video for Chinese film classics, we talked about how Sun Yu's 1934 film presents national construction as a fun road trip by showing pleasurable depictions both of its stars, Li Li, who plays Jasmine, and Jin Yan as Big Brother Jin, and of the ensemble. But a big road presumably should go somewhere, and this one needed to skirt some obstacles along the way, especially censorship. In the 1920s, on-screen sensuality was not strictly regulated. Film historian Zhi Weixiao notes that, according to one estimate from 1932, before 1931 there had been no fewer than 10 Chinese-made films with scenes of female nudity. But this all changed in the 1930s. A new film censorship board was established in Shanghai in 1928, followed in 1929 by new regulations from the central government. China's first film censorship law, which went into effect in November 1930, specifically prohibited, quote, showing the unclothed human body below the breasts and above the thigh, unquote, though this was soon revised to allow censors a bit more flexibility. Regulations also prohibited films from depicting superstitious beliefs and practices, or ghosts. The Great Road tested censorship regulations by showing nudity, ghosts, as we'll discuss a little bit more in a moment, and questionable politics being the censor's main concern. Lianhua Studio, founded in 1930, had close ties to the nationalist government, and it published a filmmaking manifesto saying that it would make nation-building films. These films would enlighten and educate the people, they would resist foreign economic invasion, and they would champion the virtues embedded in our national culture. They would not make any more supernatural ghost films. Director Sun Yu had trained in drama at the University of Madison, Wisconsin, and taken classes in cinematography, film editing, and screenwriting in New York, at the New York Institute of Photography and at Columbia University. He directed dozens of films for Lianhua between 1930 and 1937. Lianhua, despite its government ties, did take some political risks during this period. Its 1934 hit musical film, Song of the Fisherman, directed by Cai Chusheng, depicted class suffering. And Sun Yu's 1933 film Daybreak, Tianming, which also starred Li Li, had appeared on the blacklist of the Anti-Communist League. The Great Road takes some additional risks. It comments on military affairs, and it presents an idealized image of collective labor which could be interpreted as espousing communism, which both the nationalist government and the Japanese occupiers detested. One other important context is a very different type of nation building that was going on in China in the 1930s. In 1931, the Japanese army sabotaged a rail line in northern China and blamed it on Chinese insurgents, and then used this as a pretext to annex northeastern China, an area commonly known as Manchuria. The Mukden incident marked a new, more aggressive phase of Japan's imperialist ambitions in East Asia. In January of 1932, the Japanese army used another pretext to invade Shanghai, setting off a major battle. Then on February 18th of 1932, Japan proclaimed the founding of Manchukuo, the Manchu state, later installing the deposed Qing Emperor Puyi as its emperor. In 1937, the Manchukuo government launched its own big-budget film studio to compete with the Chinese film industry and with Hollywood. It even published its own film fanzines, and an editorial in one of them singled out The Great Road as an example of the type of Chinese film that the Manchukuo productions would counter. Another military context lurks in the background. At one point in the film, we see an animated map of China showing the vast landscape across which this team is building roads. This is 1934, and the image brings to mind the Long March, a military retreat from the Nationalist Army that the Chinese Communist Party began in October 1934, and which continued for over 6,000 miles along various routes until October 1935. I have not seen any direct evidence that the Long March influenced Sun Yu's film, but the timing and the theme of retreat in order to advance along a new, self-made road resonate with contemporary events. Road building is also a type of infrastructure with military as well as civilian use. In the first scene in the film of Jin working alongside his comrades, he kids around with a happy Xiaoluo on his right and asks the perennially straight-faced old Zhang on his left, "If you're so gloomy all day, will we be able to recover our lost territory?" And the phrase that Jin uses, 收复失地, had appeared in Chinese headlines in the 1930s to refer to the land that Japan had annexed. So Jin, the man in the middle, appears as a unifier, trying to buck up the morale of optimist and pessimist alike. A major turning point in the film occurs after the set-piece musical interlude of Orchid doing a romantic nighttime serenade to Xiaoluo. And at this point, the film changes from this atmosphere of fun and singing to shift quite quickly and even hastily to an urgent drama of war, treachery, torture, rescue, and martyrdom. We have a nationalist army officer riding up to announce that soldiers of the Diguo, the enemy nation, have landed in China and begun their attack. Big Zhang asks, why would they do that, since the enemy nation has already gobbled up such a large piece of territory? Right? This is a clear reference to Manchuria. Xiaoluo responds that the enemy is insatiable. Later in the film, we see images of an airplane flying overhead. And these are really just dark shadows, there's no insignia on the airplane, and the characters in the film just refer to these vaguely as the enemy. Chinese audience members in 1934 would have been quite clear about who that unnamed enemy was. It was Japan. Stanley Kwan made a film called Center Stage about the film industry in this period, and the actress who plays Li Li jokes about this censorship, calling out with mock terror, the enemy is coming, right? Since you can't say Japan. So at this juncture in the big road, Jin persuades the panicked road workers not to flee, but to finish their work so that the army can get through using their road to get to the front. The depiction of the nationalist army is quite flattering, right? The commander comments approvingly that with work proceeding day and night like this, the army will be able to get through in just 3 days. But Mr. Hu, who is listening in, is in league with the enemy and seeks to sabotage their efforts. He tries to bribe the 6 leaders of the road-building crew after a lavish banquet at his mansion, but this fails, and so he has his henchmen throw the men into the dungeon. At this point, the body politics change once again, when Jin is stripped shirtless and whipped, first in shadow against a wall, then in medium close-up. The same fate awaits the other prisoners, but they follow Jin's lead and face their punishment with a sublime smile on their faces. When the 6 men don't show up for work the next day, Jasmine redeploys her flower drum singer skills for counter-espionage. Jasmine suspects that the men are being held prisoner at Hu's mansion, and she takes Orchid to infiltrate the place. They get Hu drunk first on their bewitching smiles, then on the wine that they ply him with. Once they've gotten Mr. Hu drunk, they ask a servant girl to take them down to the dungeon, but she refuses, so Jasmine pulls out a pair of scissors and threatens to cut her throat. The other servants hear the yell, and again, Jasmine uses a deceptive smile to save them. When the other servants come to investigate, she says, oh, it was only a mouse. Jasmine's status as the Wonder Woman of action is further confirmed when she throws her scissors down to Jin in the dungeon, and then uses the servant girl's pants sash to tie her up. Orchid heads back to spread the word to the other workers, while Jasmine stays behind to complete the honey trap on Mr. Hu. So in this proletarian fantasy, we have a young woman raising the alarm, the masses outside are moved to action, and even the army joins in the cause to see justice done. Back at the prison, Jin manages to free himself with Jasmine's scissors, but the stoic pessimist Zhang Yu is martyred on his cross when the jailer throws a knife at him. He repays the favor, saving Jin in the process. Jasmine upstairs not only manages to trap the traitor to the nation, or Mai Guozei, as she calls him, but also to produce evidence of his treachery. Similar scenes of dungeon torture, infiltrating the bad guy's lair, and theatrical public indignation of the oppressed, held in check only by the authority of the army or the state, reappear in later communist films such as The White-Haired Girl from 1950 and The Red Detachment of Women from 1960. But what disappears in these later films is this cross-current of humor, which we see in Jasmine's mischievous smile, or even in Zhang Yu's dying gesture of a face swipe. With justice served on the local tyrant, the team, this time with Jasmine pulling ropes alongside the men, get the road back on track under the watchful eye of the army, still singing their work song of unity and progress. Xiaoluo gets to fulfill his dream and rides alongside on a mechanical steamroller. But what might have been a conventional ending takes a surprising turn in the last 5 minutes of the film, when the road-building party is suddenly strafed by an enemy airplane. A rapid montage of low-angle shots of the airplanes, extreme close-ups of victims' eyes and mouths, point-of-view shots from the airplane, and long shots of the carnage represent the deadly attack in just a few seconds. Big Brother Jin, lying wounded amongst his dead or dying colleagues, manages to shoot down the enemy plane with a rifle when it makes another pass. He then crawls over to Jasmine and, for the first time, just as she dies, holds her hand. Orchid's father, looking on, laments that they're all dead, but Orchid replies, "No, they're not dead." And then a vision appears before her eyes, and ours. Superimposition shows the souls of the dead workers rising up from their corpses and going on their way, singing their work song, with Xiaoluo driving a ghost steamroller. The message is clear that though the individuals may be killed, the spirit of collective work for the nation will continue into the future. The novelty image, however, somewhat distracts from the patriotic message. It's a visual gag straight out of the cinema of attractions, which is pleasurable in its own right. The image is also somewhat inconsistent with Lianhua Studio's own filmmaking manifesto. It had claimed that its films would displace the ghost films of old. Instead, The Great Road creates a new type of ghost, the undying collective spirit of national construction.